Welcome. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Hello. Is that better? Is that better? All right. Welcome, everyone. Hello. I am Brooke Clement. I'm the director here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, which is part of the... Okay. Part of the National Archives and Records Administration, and it is a distinct pleasure to have you here this evening. As always, I want to express my sincere appreciation to our partners, the Gerald Ford Foundation, and its staff for their continued and truly valued support of the Library and Museum. Before we start, can I please just ask you to ensure that your cell phones are either turned off or are set on silent. And while you do that, I'm going to briefly highlight some of our upcoming events here at the Ford Museum. So on March 11th, which is next week, we are hosting Brian Becker, who will be talking about his father's pivotal behind-the-scenes role in the lead up to the Nixon pardon. On March 25th, we are going to be hosting Thomas DeFrank, the author of Write It When I'm Gone, as he discusses his experiences as a White House pool reporter during the Bicentennial. And on April 14th, General Stanley McChrystal is going to be here to talk about his book on character, Choices That Define a Life. For more details about these and other programs and our upcoming exhibits, please visit our website at fordlibrarymuseum.gov. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Gleaves Whitney.
Really appreciate your introduction, Brooke, and right back at you. I think that our partnership's just amazing. You know, our staff love your staff. We all work well together to bring you really high quality programs. So thank you very much. What a great crowd. I see a number of friends here. It's great to see. It just seems like the winter has bogged everybody down, and here you are, enthusiastic. I feel the energy in the room. We have some Ford family members. We're Bob and Karen. Yep, there you are. Thanks for being here, Ford family. Appreciate you. We also have a number of former trustees and current trustees here. Raise your hand, please, because we appreciate all that you contribute. Yes, there's Hank, of course, in the front row, and I think John Babb, where are you? There you are. Stephen Waterbury, yes, anybody else? Thank you for all your service and work on behalf of this foundation. Well, here at the Ford, we have been celebrating a series of rolling 50th anniversaries. Those of you who are regulars know how we've been very carefully curating programs around significant events 50 years ago. The Ford presidency was 895 days long, and we've tried to hit the high points all along the way. And it's hard to believe, but in just 10 short months, it's going to come to an end. You know, on January 20th, 2027, we'll be at the last Ford 50th anniversary while he was president, when we celebrate the transition, peaceful transition of power from President Ford to his successor, Jimmy Carter. And it's going to be kind of a wistful experience, I think, for us. And we're looking very forward to really having a great event. So speaking of upcoming events, make sure that Wednesday, January 20th, is on your calendar. It's only 10 months away. Brooke, you and I, we've got some planning that we're still doing, and it's going to be a lot of fun and very meaningful. Well, since August 9th, 2024, as I say, we've been trying to collect the best stories and insights into the legacy of President Ford. Now, legacy expresses itself in so many ways. Of course, here in the museum and in the library in Ann Arbor, and you've got so many ways that Gerald Ford's name attaches to streets and a freeway and an airport and an aircraft carrier, which has been in the news so much, but also, of course, in articles and in books and in eulogies. And I just want to highlight again, and this is upstairs, but I think it's one of the most profound things you can think about in terms of legacy. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's eulogy, in particular, always strikes me, and I went back to it again today in preparation for these remarks, these brief remarks, and he put Ford's life and legacy in world historical context when he said, quote, "According to an ancient tradition, God preserves humanity despite its many transgressions because at any one period there exist 10 just individuals who, without being aware of their role, redeem humankind. Gerald Ford was such a man." Close quote. To me, that is a stunning assertion. And so anybody who would approach doing a biography, an authoritative biography, a complete accounting of the life of this remarkable man, has a courage and a tenacity that is worthy of note too. And to tell the story the way Richard Norton Smith, one of America's great political biographers, presidential historians, and raconteurs, the way he does it, thoroughly and more deeply than anyone else, why Ford was such a consequential leader, is so valuable. It's a gift to Grand Rapids, it's a gift to this museum and the library over in Ann Arbor, and it's a gift to the country. And I just think that Richard's work did so much to raise our appreciation, our awareness. It's a tour de force that knits together, think about it, more than 10 years of labor, more than thousands and thousands of documents, and more than 150, hundreds of interviews with people who knew President Ford. And some of those interviews, I get the feeling, are still going on as Richard continues to mull the significance of President Ford. And he titled his work, "An Ordinary Man." Now, Richard, I'm going to dare to disagree with you just a little bit here, but I think that it's called irony because I think most readers come away and wonder if the title should have been "No Ordinary Man." Again, note the irony. Now, John Meacham, upon reading "An Ordinary Man," summed up the author in his work this way, quote, "Richard Norton Smith has brought a lifetime of wisdom, insight, and storytelling verve to the life of a consequential president, Gerald R. Ford. Ford's is a very American life, and Smith has charted its vicissitudes and import with great grace and illuminating perspective, a marvelous achievement." So we are delighted and honored to welcome Richard back to our stage. We are also delighted and honored to have Hank Meijer back on our stage. Hank is executive chairman of Meijer, the family retail business he began working at the age of 11 as a grocery clerk. And after that humble start, Hank served as editor and publisher of a weekly newspaper in Plymouth, Michigan, rejoined Meijer in 1979, wrote a couple of books, really interesting reads. First of all, a biography of his grandfather, Hendrik Meijer, that appeared in 1985, and then a book that more people maybe are familiar with now, the biography, is a marvelous biography of Senator Arthur Vandenberg, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2017. Hank serves on many boards, but here at the Ford, we are especially appreciative that he is the vice chair of our board here at the Ford Foundation. When Hank and Richard get together, I think they have a wonderful rapport with each other. We saw this in 2023 when Richard's book with the ironic title came out, and we planned 6 different places to go around Michigan and have the two of them talk about Richard's work and the significance of Gerald Ford's life. And I don't think you will be disappointed tonight either. So please give a warm welcome to Richard Norton Smith and Hank Meijer. Now, before they begin their conversation, Richard had a very interesting idea. Richard's a great choreographer of events, and he said he would like to begin this evening with some clips, particularly of President Ford's Monticello speech in 1974, so the bicentennial, July 5th, 1974. So we're going to begin with a couple of minutes of that, and then at the conclusion of those clips, Hank Meijer and Richard Norton Smith will enter their dialogue. Thank you.
In my judgment, the most magnificent achievement of our 200 years as a nation. Black is beautiful was a motto of genius which uplifted us far above its intention once Americans had thought about it and perceived its truth. we began to realize that so were brown, white, red, and yellow beautiful. When I was young, a Sunday school teacher told us that the beauty of Joseph's coat was its many colors. I believe Americans are beautiful, individually, in communities, and freely joined together by dedication to the United States of America. I see a growing danger in this country to conformity of thought and taste and behavior. We need more encouragement and protection for individuality. The wealth we have of culture, ethnic and religious and racial traditions are valuable counterbalances to the overpowering sameness and subordination of totalitarian societies. The sense of belonging to any group that stands for something decent and noble, so long as it does not confine the free spirits of or cultivate hostility to others, is part of the pride every American should have in the heritage of the past. That heritage is rooted now not in England alone, as indebted as we are for the Magna Carta and the common law, but not in Europe alone, or in Africa alone, or Asia, or on the islands of the sea. The American adventure draws from the best of all of mankind's long sojourn here on Earth, and now reaches out into the solar system. It's good to know that in our own lifetime, we have taken part in the growth of freedom and in the expansion of equality, which began here so long ago. This union of corrected wrongs and expanded rights has brought the blessings of liberty to 215 million Americans, but the struggle for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is never truly won. Each generation of Americans, indeed of all humanity, must strive to achieve these aspirations anew. Liberty is a living flame to be fed, not dead ashes to be revered. Even in a bicentennial year, it is fitting that we ask ourselves hard questions, even on a glorious day like today. Are the institutions under which we live working the way they should? Are the foundations laid in 1776 and 1789 still strong enough and sound enough to resist the tremors of our times? Are our God-given rights secure, our hard-won liberties protected? The very fact that we can ask these questions, that we can freely examine and criticize our society, is cause for confidence itself. Many of the voices raised in doubt 200 years ago are served to strengthen and improve the decisions finally made. The American adventure is a continuing process. As one milestone is passed, another is sighted. As we achieve one goal, a longer lifespan, a literate population, a leadership in world affairs, we raise our sights.
We're embarking on our semi-quincentennial.
And you know Gerald Ford would never be able to pronounce.
Well, and I was scared about that, but it is, and so we'll call it America's 250 for shorthand, and that's much easier for all of us. But that brings us back to when President Ford came into office. I'm sure that Richard Nixon was hoping that he would be the centerpiece of that celebration, and it proved not to be. What did the bicentennial mean to President Ford?
Well, I'll tell you a Nixon story. It gives you an idea of what his mood was on July 4th. True story. Nixon is he may have actually been out with the Annenbergs, but in any event, with a group of people. And, you know, if you remember, the networks were on all day, and they were following the president as he hopscotched up and down the East Coast, giving a number of speeches. And Nixon was coolly assessing his performance and said, do you think anyone is going to quote anything Jerry Ford said today? And I suspect that was not an entirely objective, detached, impersonal critique. I think there's something funny about these anniversary years, even the ones that are easy to pronounce. The centennial was the first big observance, and there was a World's Fair in Philadelphia, and Ulysses Grant was in the White House, and it was the last and the worst year of his 8 years, and his Secretary of War was being impeached for corruption and Indian trading posts. And one of the many Army veterans who was called upon to testify to validate, in fact, the charges against Secretary Belknap, very reluctant because he knew Ulysses Grant would not take kindly to this, was George Armstrong Custer, who got out of Washington as fast as he could, and 9 days before the 4th of July, Custer had his last stand. So you can imagine how the news settled on the country. Custer and I think 238, basically everyone under his command who was wiped out that day. And that's the news that greeted America as it woke up on the centennial day. 100 years later, I often say, you know, there are many ways of measuring a presidency. And the typical, you look at economic statistics, you could look at the legislation passed, you could, you know, innovations, programs, tangibles. I think the best way to measure Gerald Ford's impact on history is intangible. And that is to simply compare the mood in this country in the summer of 1974, when I can guarantee you there were not a lot of people who were planning their schedule around the bicentennial. There were, in fact, millions of people who wondered American democracy as we knew it would be around 2 years hence. But in fact, and I'm sure there's some people here tonight who remember vividly, it was a great birthday party. 1 million people in St. Louis assembled under the Gateway Arch, you know, out of nowhere. And that scene was repeated all across the country. It was a grassroots celebration. The original idea, you know, back in the Johnson administration, they started planning for the bicentennial, and it didn't go well. The country was so divided, and of course we forget, you know, the bicentennial in effect capped a decade, more than a decade, of turmoil in this country. Presidential and other assassinations, riots in the streets, campus upheaval, obviously the Vietnam War and the loss of credibility in government, and then Watergate on top of it. And all of that, in effect, was inherited by the former congressman from Grand Rapids. And 2 years later, it was a very different country, measured only imperfectly in the traditional statistics. But if anyone, I remember vividly, because I lived in Massachusetts, and we think we invented the revolution. and we think we really invented the country. Somebody named Columbus was out there at the on the fringes at one point, and we let a few Virginians think that they invented the country. But in any event, I remember sitting in front of CBS and Uncle Walter for 18 hours without pause, and just being blown away. It was a nonpartisan day, and people just felt good. They felt good. In part, they felt good about the country. They felt good about themselves, and something that nobody could have imagined, I think 2 years earlier, they felt good about the direction of our democracy, that we had withstood a whole series of stress tests. And on the 4th of July, we cut loose. Ford gave several speeches around that weekend. If you've been to the Air and Space Museum in Washington, which has just undergone a huge, big renovation, he opened that museum on July 1st and spoke at the National Archives in front of the Declaration. But on the Sunday, he started off at Valley Forge. There was a wagon train that basically had started off 6 months earlier from the West Coast. And it picked up, anyway, this huge, thousands of people, and they all assembled on the morning of July 4th, and the president was there. Valley Forge had been a state park, and after that day, it was a National Historic Site, became part of the Park Service. Then, of course, we went downtown. The second speech you heard, the first was at a naturalization ceremony at Monticello on the 5th of July. And by that time, I think everyone was just kind of exhausted from partying all weekend. And yet, I think that's the best speech Ford gave as president. And you heard just a bit of it. It's extraordinarily contemporary. I mean, it's on YouTube. Take a look. It's a speech that you could give. You'd like to hear a president give today.
Dare I ask who wrote it?
I don't know. Bob Hartman was in charge of the opera. There were 5 speeches. Actually, that made it 6. And actually, they put them together in a booklet called The American Adventure. And it was, and each of the speeches had a different theme. So obviously, the Air and Space Museum. And there was a wonderful passage in front of the Declaration of Independence. Ford, said all the usual things about Jefferson and the Declaration, and promises that had been unkept, and the challenges of making certain that the Declaration was a living document. But he had this wonderful passage that I don't think I've ever heard anyone else say. He recommended you should all read the boring parts of the Declaration of Independence, which are this laundry list, this arraignment of King George III, and all of the offenses, and all of the reasons why we don't have a king 200 years later. It's a wonderfully fresh, and in fact, I remember first time I came across it, I thought, that's interesting. And I went back and I read the boring parts of the Declaration, and they're not as boring as you think. In any event, the big sort of set piece of the day was the second speech, which was in front of Independence Hall. And there were 1 million people on the Mall in Center City, Philadelphia. And then, as I say, he went to New York Harbor. Remember the tall ships, which I think for a lot of people are the memory they have of the bicentennial. It was the largest, most impressive international flotilla ever assembled, and they were all in New York Harbor, sailed up the Hudson, up to the George Washington Bridge, turned around, and millions of people. There were estimated 8 million New Yorkers. Well, at that point, there were only about 9 million New Yorkers in the 5 boroughs. So I think they invited a few relatives from New Jersey to join them. But it was, you know, the problem with the bicentennial, of course, is like any great party, parties are very finite events. And what do you remember? Well, I guess people remember Truman Capote's black and white ball. This was not a black and white ball. This was a much more populist, street corner assembly.
What would it have been like if, I mean, we can only conjecture, if Ford had not pardoned Nixon and that were still clouding the world?
Yeah, and again, it's counterfactual history. But I will say, I mean, the problem with people who tell us now, 50 years later, that Ford should not have pardoned Nixon because, you know, it set up later offenses. First of all, I always say, we do not elect our presidents for their clairvoyance. We elect them for their competence and vision, which is not the same thing. You know, and presidents, like the rest of us, have to deal with the reality that confronts them at the time. If he had not pardoned Nixon, well, he wrote about it. Nixon's trial, Ford believed that Richard Nixon would be indicted, at least for obstruction of justice. He strongly suspected that he would be convicted. And then he'd face, you know, the question all over again. But more than that, the media, it was said, you know, when Edward VIII abdicated to marry Mrs. Simpson, that it was the biggest story since the resurrection. I think probably people at the Washington Post thought Watergate was a little bigger than eternal life. It promised them eternal life in the newspaper business. And the fact of the matter is, understandably, you know, the country was obsessed. The media was obsessed. And one of the reasons that Ford, and again, it seemed very esoteric at the time, and frankly, I don't think he explained it terribly well. But if he had not pardoned Nixon when he did, he would have been president in name only. The country would still be mired in Watergate. The media would still be covering the greatest story of their life. And what would that do for the bicentennial? I guarantee you, there wouldn't be 1 million people under the Gateway Arch celebrating, not just celebrating the abstraction of liberty and freedom and democratic values. What made it such an extraordinary occasion, they were celebrating each other.
It was almost as though, and of course we can gloss over it in our collective memories, but the clouds were parting. There was a level of sunshine there that couldn't have been imagined a few months earlier.
No, that's true. That's absolutely true. And it wasn't enough to get him reelected. I think people had decided, for whatever reason, that Gerald Ford had successfully fulfilled his historical mission.
Well, and there was still stagflation, even as other elements of his
I mean, inflation was coming down, but as we all know, I mean, I find it's fascinating, you know, you would have thought we were all victims of the worst inflation in history. You know, boy, people do have short memories. It's 3%. 3% is said to be kind of a threshold. Anything above 3, well, you know, there was double-digit inflation in the 70s. And it wasn't because of a president. It was in large part because of policies that produced the oil embargo from the Middle East. And the sudden shock of doubling and tripling oil prices. We were much more dependent then, even than we are now, and we're still too dependent now. But Yeah. It's like the first George Bush. You know, I mean, he came out of the Iraq War with, what, a 90% approval rating? And no one could believe it, but a year and a half later, he was defeated by a relatively unknown governor of a relatively insignificant state. And nobody would have predicted it. But in retrospect, you can see people thought, and George Bush did exactly what his historical agenda called for. He got us through peacefully the end of the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union and its empire. And there's nothing that says any of that had to happen the way it did. And that's not a bad legacy to have, but it wasn't enough to get him reelected.
You had mentioned we opened with the centennial in 1876.
Yeah.
What we had the million people in Philadelphia and the million people in St. Louis. Despite the shadow cast by Custer's last stand, what did the celebrations look like in 1876?
Well, it was much more centralized. You see, the original idea about the bicentennial was, you know, we always fight the last wars. So there was a great World's Fair in Philadelphia then, so there was going to be a great World's Fair. And there was a knockdown, drag-out fight between Boston and Philadelphia. Who was going to be the center of attention? Certainly not only on the 4th of July, but and each city laid claim, you know, Boston's the cradle of liberty, and Philadelphia is Philadelphia. And the interesting thing was, as I said, it started under the Johnson administration. And then Richard Nixon came into power. And Richard Nixon, for some reason, didn't feel like giving Ted Kennedy's hometown a $1 billion shot in the arm. And it turns out he wasn't any more inclined to give it to Philadelphia, which had voted, what, 80%, you know, for his opponent, and would vote 80% whoever his opponent was. And so, guess what? They made a virtue out of necessity. Politics intruded. Nobody was willing to really bite the bullet. And so there was no World's Fair. But it turned out that was probably a good thing, because instead of having all your energy, or, you know, a disproportionate amount of your energy focused on one place, however impressive it might have been, this way it was spread out evenly. And it was instead of being imposed from above, it literally was ground up. And by the way, there was plenty of room for dissent. It didn't just happen on the 4th of July. The whole Ford presidency was bracketed by this period of national soul searching, which is what the bicentennial was. More than a year before the 4th of July, the president kicked it off. He went to Boston for the 200th anniversary of Concord and Lexington, which meant Paul Revere's ride. Well, I lived a couple miles from the Old North Church, and there is an aura to that place. And the president said he was reminded of going to school in Grand Rapids, and, you know, that's what he knew about Paul Revere, you know, and the ride, and so forth and so on. Maybe not terribly sophisticated, but it didn't have to be sophisticated. He said he felt goosebumps when he walked into that church that night. And you know, one can understand why. But here's the interesting thing. That was April 18th of 1775. The next morning, the 19th, he spoke at the Old North Bridge in Concord. And there was a big, big crowd. But half of the crowd, there were 25,000 protesters from something called the People's Bicentennial. And they were protesting Vietnam, and they were protesting, you know, consumerism, and you name it. Because, believe it or not, American corporate interests had concluded that the bicentennial held profitable possibilities. And you know, I think McDonald's came out with a Paul Revere burger, and Betsy Ross showed up on Delta Airlines. Anyway, you get the picture. So there was plenty to protest. They almost drowned him out, speaking there in front of the Minuteman statue at the bridge. But here's the extraordinary thing. That visit took place, remember, it's April of 1975. 11 days later, Saigon fell. The most dramatic, the cruelest day of the Ford presidency. When he said it was the low point of his presidency. He said to sit in the Oval Office and watch the United States get kicked out of Indochina after all the blood and the treasure that had been expended there, he said was nobody can appreciate how humiliating. Well, that absolute humiliation came just 10 days after the extraordinary mountaintop experience of lighting a lantern for the 3rd century of American independence in the place where it all began. It's hard to imagine the roller coaster ride that even in normal times a president and his family take, and 1976 was not normal for good and for ill.
But you mentioned, so a year earlier, there wouldn't have been a celebratory mood in the country. It wouldn't have been
No,
possible.
I think that's true. I mean, obviously in Boston that night, there was a great crowd and a lot of local pride, just as there is every year on April 18th and 19th. But you're right, it was more, in some ways, faithfully portrayed in those 25,000 angry protesters who almost drowned out the president at the Old North Bridge the next day. And of course, I know you're saying, oh, that's just Massachusetts. But where would we be without Massachusetts?
Well, if my memory serves me, when Ford Museum exhibits were originally being created, the bicentennial still loomed very large as an element of Ford's presidency.
That's true, but I think it was more as a kind of the celebration, the fiesta, as opposed to now. I mean, you can find scholars who write learned tomes and find political science and psychological and other aspects, to the story. I mean, back when this museum was just being imagined, I think, we were all still very close to the events, and to most people, it was just one hell of a party. But it was also a party that left lasting, favorable memories. And I think you're right. I mean, just in the year and a half between the president's visit to the Old North Church and his visit to Valley Forge and Independence Hall, there weren't 25,000 protesters anywhere. And that's not to say that, people had forgotten why they were angry. But again, it's that remarkable turnaround that happened in those 2 years.
They were picturing a different president at that point.
I think they were. It's hard to imagine if Richard Nixon had survived Watergate, there'd still be a Watergate scandal. There'd still be friction, to put it mildly, between the White House and Capitol Hill. The media would have been obsessed with, trying to unsolve or solve the mystery. And if you had dragged all that baggage into what was supposed to be, in many ways, a non-political, non-partisan, thoughtful celebration of American nationhood, it would have been a very, very different bicentennial.
It might have been like the semi-quincentennial. I didn't mean to get into that tonight. But.
By the way, Philadelphia, you can't go home again. In 1926, that was the first unpronounceable. It was a sesquicentennial. And Philadelphia decided, hey, this worked great 50 years ago. We'll have another World's Fair. And it bombed. I mean, it was a disaster. And President Coolidge was in the White House and was finally prevailed upon to show up at this thing. And the reporter asked, I don't think he was terribly enthused about the whole thing, the whole trip. He asked him, how are you going? And Coolidge, being Coolidge, said, I'm going as an exhibit. That's about the only thing memorable about the sesquicentennial. The fair bombed, and I suspect, literally, by 1976, Philadelphia's case to be the obvious host for the nation's celebration had been considerably marred. Plus, it voted 80% Democratic. So, I think between the two of them.
Well, not to digress too far, but I do get the impression that Philadelphia has suffered from a history that Boston has marketed itself better with the Freedom Trail or whatever it is. They've never been able to do that in Philadelphia as successfully.
That's interesting. I don't know. I'm a big fan of Philadelphia, Center City. I think it's like an urban Williamsburg. There's a square mile in Philadelphia where hats off to the National Park Service, have done a remarkable job piecing together the story. I mean, for the bicentennial, one of the things they did, the house, we know where Jefferson wrote the Declaration. We know what it looked like, but the house no longer existed. And in those days, the government was willing to sort of think big and put their money into it. And so anyway, if you go to Philadelphia today, you can see a full-scale, authentic reproduction of the house and the room where Jefferson holed up for a couple of weeks and wrote multiple drafts of the most important thing he ever wrote. But there's no substitute for being there. And if you go to Philadelphia, which, I hope if you haven't, you have a chance. Of course, Hank is associated with the spectacular Constitution Museum. There is also a newer museum, the Museum of the American Revolution, which is, for my money, one of the 5 or 6 best history museums I've ever been in. And it will take a half a day, and you walk through this whole story from beginning to, there isn't an end. It's open-ended. That's the message. In effect, the next chapter of the story is written in his museum, where we tried to define the revolution and put it in paper.
Well, and actually the National Constitution Center's tagline for the America's 250 is "The story continues." And
Absolutely.
That present and future sense, I think, is critical. And I think President Ford conveyed that beautifully at Monticello.
Yeah, and the other thing is, it's the 250th anniversary of the Declaration, and that's a big deal. But if you have a thing for bicentennials, and you're not willing to let the bicentennial motif go, this July 4th is the bicentennial of something that if you were writing this as a novel, you would never think of, because it's just too improbable. The fact that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the same day, about 5 hours apart, one in Massachusetts, one in Virginia, obviously not knowing the famous story, and who knows, that Adams' last words were, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." Well, he couldn't know that Jefferson had died at Monticello about 5 hours earlier. When President Ford went on the 5th of July to Monticello to address that naturalization ceremony. By the way, typical Ford. He gave a speech, about 15 minutes, and he didn't leave. He stayed. He stayed, and he met personally every single new American citizen and their families who were assembled on the lawn at Monticello. And then he got in the car, and they drove him down, halfway down the little mountain, to the cemetery that Jefferson had created in tribute to his youthful friend and fellow scholar, a man named Dabney Carr. When Jefferson and Dabney Carr were studying in college together, William and Mary, they used to take their books and they would meet on this side of the mountain, a couple hundred feet down from the summit where the house would be one day. And it held great sentimental attachment. And they made a deal. Whoever died first would be interred there on the little mountain by whoever survived him. And Dabney Carr, who became Jefferson's brother-in-law, as well as his best friend, died of a fever. He was in his 30s. And his death was the beginning of the Monticello graveyard. And anyway, my favorite photo in the book, my favorite photo that I've ever seen among the hundreds of thousands that are at the library, it's President Ford that day, the 5th of July. Well, the 5th of July that day was the 150th anniversary of Thomas Jefferson's funeral, because he was buried the day after he died in a very simple ceremony next to Dabney Carr. And anyway, there's this wonderful photo of President Ford standing alone in front of Jefferson's tombstone. Remember the famous, with the epitaph that Jefferson himself wrote, the 3 things he wanted to be remembered for. And there was no mention of being President of the United States. But author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Those are the 3 things that Jefferson wanted us to remember him for. And anyway, it's just a marvelous image of Gerald Ford, who in many ways was the product, unlikely product, of a history that began with Jefferson in his study at Monticello, boning up on his ideas that would find expression in the Declaration that he wrote in that boarding house in Philadelphia, to be followed by the Constitution, to which Gerald Ford took an oath multiple times. The continuity, I don't know about you, I mean, that's what we celebrate.
And this is the day after the party's over, and here's President Ford in
the party wasn't
standing
over.
alone,
the Fords,
communing.
Yeah, the Fords got back from New York Harbor, and they welcomed everyone to the Truman balcony at the White House, because Washington, D.C. was putting on the biggest fireworks show in its history that night. Some people were watching, I don't know, I still remember, great daily double on Jeopardy, the largest crowd ever assembled for a concert that night was on the Esplanade in Boston, where 400,000 people gathered to hear Arthur Fiedler conduct the Boston Pops, topped off, of course, by the 1812 Overture, and the biggest fireworks display in their history. But in any event, it was a great way to end the day. Well, but for Gerald Ford, the day, it wasn't over yet. And the next day, he got in a helicopter, 8 o'clock in the morning, and flew down to Charlottesville. And as I say, went through Monticello. I don't know if he'd ever been in the house before. and then gave this marvelous little capsule of what the bicentennial was all about and what it was that not only Americans were celebrating, but the newest Americans were celebrating by coming here, by joining the party, and by being welcomed for all of the contributions that they would make to the country.
Really the embodiment of how the story continues.
Absolutely. I mean, it'll be interesting to see, this year will be the 200th anniversary of Jefferson's death, and be interesting to see what they do.
Absolutely. Well, and we wanted to leave some time for questions and would love to hear from you on your thoughts. And so, Richard, what we would welcome.
We might want to bring the lights up, only because
we can't see you.
Yeah, well, because I think, yeah, there are a couple of people with microphones. And at least now you can see, and they can see you.
Yeah, we can start with Doug, right here.
Thank you, Hank. And I know historians hate this question, but how will the tricentennial look back on this year's situation?
I said we don't elect our presidents for their clairvoyance. I should have included historians. I don't have the slightest idea.
Look today.
What's that? I'm sorry? What?
How does it look today to you?
Well, now you're asking for punditry. See how I can evade? No, I have enough trouble making sense out of the past that I can document with lots of facts and documents and so on and so on. And I have been around long enough, and all of you have been around long enough to know that whatever it is we're experiencing right now, it's polarizing in the extreme, and it'd be nice to get through a 250th anniversary without further dividing us. And I've found that, unfortunately, almost whatever you say, I don't do cable TV anymore. I haven't done it for several years. And it's not because of individuals per se, it's because it doesn't matter if it's Fox or MS Now, they call you because they're confident in advance of what you're going to say. It's as if the script is written, and whatever it is you're going to say is going to agree with their audience. And I got spoiled. Jim Lehrer was my mentor, and he said more than once, you know, we were a historians panel, and sometimes the two roles do conflict. But there's a historian and there's a pundit, and never the twain shall meet. I'm writing a book. Oh, I have one last big book in me, and I've been working for 3 years on a comprehensive and opinionated kind of what have I learned, what have I changed my mind about, history of the presidency, with a chapter on every president. And I am surprised. I'm up to Lincoln. And now it's sort of all downhill. But I am amazed every day with what I thought I knew and how I've changed my mind. And, you know, so anyway, there'll be lots of opinions there, but I'll leave the opinions to the editorial writers.
I have one of the mics here. First of all, thanks for being here, and thanks for all your work on the Ford Museum. I'm going to give you a dealer's choice, but 3 issues that are in the news today, and if you have any stories or anecdotes to tell. Something about the Olympics, 1976 maybe Olympics, White House renovation, and Iran.
I will take the least controversial. because it's a wonderful story that tells you so much about who Gerald Ford was, and in a sense, the values that this town bred into him. In 1976, that was the year the Montreal Summer Games. And I think one of the year Bruce Jenner was the hero. Anyway, the president invited the entire American team to the White House. But nothing unusual about that. I mean, the fact is, Gerald Ford loved to be around jocks. I mean, it will not surprise you. It was strange. He had this thing. I remember talking to the White House social secretary, and I said, "How did you select?" Well, he said, "Oh, listen, no, they went over the lists." Mrs. Ford loved Hollywood. She got to dance with Fred Astaire one night. That was, something she'd never forget. She and Cary Grant became good friends. In fact, he introduced her at the Republican convention in '76. On the other hand, the one person on the list that Maria told me about that Mrs. Ford vetoed was Jack Nicholson. She said, I don't think so, Maria, for whatever reason. Anyway, but the president had this thing for catchers. For some reason, Carlton Fisk and
Joe Garagiola.
well, Joe Garagiola, of course. Was it Brooks Robinson? Or who's the Baltimore? No, well, Cal Ripken. Anyway, he had this thing about catchers for some reason, and they were always being invited to state dinners. So anyway, he was really looking forward. But what made the day and what makes the story, there was a guest of honor that day, and it was Jesse Owens. When Jesse Owens came back for the 1936 Olympics, the Berlin Games, the Hitler Games, he had a ticker tape parade in Manhattan. But when he got to the Waldorf for a dinner in his honor, he couldn't use the front door. And it was noticed that the Roosevelt White House invited the rest of the team, but they did not invite the most celebrated medal winner of the games. It was an election year. And so Gerald Ford thought, in some small way, we're going to make it up to Jesse Owens. And so in August of 1976, he made sure that he was not only the guest of honor, along with the contemporary Olympic team, but he surprised him by giving him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor the country can bestow. And Owens was, but it's even more personal than that. Jesse Owens, of course, was from Ohio State. Willis Ward was President Ford's best friend on the Michigan football team, but Willis Ward was a great track and field star. That's his original claim to athletic greatness. And the assumption was the Berlin Games were going to be, in effect, a two-man contest, not between Germany and the United States, but between Ohio and Michigan. And unfortunately, you've heard me tell the story about the game, the one game, the only game that Michigan won in Ford's senior year was against Georgia Tech. And Georgia Tech said, we won't play if you put your black player on the field. And the university did not rally to Willis Ward's defense. Ford seriously considered quitting the team, and Ward told him not to. He said, play this game for me. And the best evidence of that, it was a lousy game. I think they won 7-2, and it rained. But the great scene, why someone hasn't made a movie about this, I don't know. At the beginning of the second half, Ford and another of his teammates were out, obviously, on the line of scrimmage, and someone on the Georgia Tech came up to him and said, "Where's your," and he used the N-word, "player?" And on the very next play, Ford and his teammate teamed up and knocked this guy unconscious. And he was carried off the field on a stretcher. And Ford told Willis Ward, "That one was for you." Well, Willis Ward was so disappointed in the official non-support that the whole, I mean, the amount of work, training, preparation, obviously for the Olympics, takes over your life. And he'd lost that competitive urge, and so he didn't go to Berlin. So the story of Berlin turned out to be not Willis Ward and Jesse Owens, but Jesse Owens versus Adolf Hitler. Pretty good story. And Gerald Ford made certain, he said, "Jesse, I was at the track meet. I watched you, the Olympic trials," and he saw, Owens set a number of records that day before he ever got to Berlin. So he may have been from Ohio, but there's no doubt that there were a lot of people in Michigan who were pulling for him.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's.
Some of us are struggling to figure out how to celebrate July 4th, 2026. I have to say, I'm very grateful to you for helping me reclaim my American citizenship by listening to your video of why Ford pardoned Nixon. Reading the excerpts from your book helped me reclaim a belief in this country. So I'd like to ask you on a more positive tone, if you were the man in charge of our celebration this year, how could we help Americans have faith in our country?
I would bring Walter Cronkite back. And I would bring the old CBS back. I'd even put up with Dan Rather. No, seriously. I understand what you're saying. And I suspect there are a lot of people, not just in this room, who have to feel very ambivalent. But I think what you have to tell yourself is, what you're celebrating is an idea. And that idea has been tested many times and in many ways. And there have been times in our past when we doubted that it would survive. And yet, it's interesting. A woman named Catherine Drinker Bowen wrote a classic book about the Constitutional Convention. It was called Miracle at Philadelphia. And it was actually a quote from George Washington, who said that what happened was nothing short of a miracle. And I always tell people the miracle at Philadelphia was that 55 white men, who were not particularly representative, even then, of a diverse, stratified country. Most of them were lawyers. A number of them were slave owners. But this kind of improbable elitist gathering wrote a document and created a system of government, although based on some regrettable compromises, made it possible to grow our way out of those compromises toward a more truly representative, more inclusive government. It took a long time. It took over 100 years for women to get the most basic of democratic rights, the vote. And there have been times when it seems like one step forward and two steps back. But over and over again, most, having just written a chapter on Lincoln, there's the ultimate test. Very few people in March of 1861, listening to Lincoln's first inaugural, would have given you odds that there would be a United States. Fewer still could have imagined how profoundly redefined the country would be, and its government. And that struggle to define, redefine, reapply the idea, the Jeffersonian defining missionary concept that all men are created equal. It has inspired and continues to inspire millions, if not billions of people around the world. And so whatever we do this 4th of July, it seems to me, we might take a moment, first of all, to profoundly thank that extraordinary cast of founders who, for all of their imperfections and shortcomings, showed a level of courage and perseverance. And I don't mean just the people who gathered in Independence Hall to sign a document, but I mean the tens of thousands of people who bled into the snows at Valley Forge and who devoted their lives and were prepared to die for that idea. And it's the idea that after 250 years is still contested, endangered, challenged, interpreted, misinterpreted. But it's the closest thing we have to a common language. It's the closest thing we have to a definition of what it means to be Americans. That's what President Ford said at Monticello on the 5th of July. It was an idea. And in his time, there were millions of people who thought maybe the idea, its time had passed. And there are people in our own time who harbor similar fears. And I don't dismiss those fears at all. But I think the best way to meet them, the more you know about the American past, the more optimistic you will be about the American future.
Well, you have delivered reason for optimism today, so thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you. Thank you. Quick. And I can't let you go without a brief commercial, because people like to know after the fact. You may know I lead 2 history tours a year. We get a bus for 50 people and we limit it to 25, so you don't feel like a cattle herd. And we go to museums and presidential homes and grave sites and battlefields and presidential libraries and you name it. And it's a deep dive with a group of people who have been doing this for 25 years. And we're going to Vermont for a week in June and Rhode Island for a week in October. And you know what? They're small, but they are packed with history, from, gosh, Ethan Allen to Ben and Jerry's in Vermont. So anyway, if you have any interest at all or curiosity, you can go online. It's called presidentsandpatriots.com, one word, and at least you can find out a little bit more about how we are going to celebrate the 250th.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Richard and Hank, for a very enlightening evening. This always exceeds even our expectations. There are always twists and turns that are fascinating. I would suggest that the semi-quincentennial will actually go on another 15 years as we go through from the Declaration of Independence to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 in July, to the Constitution, 1787 September, to the Bill of Rights in 1791. I think we got 15 years ahead of us, so stay tuned.
You bet.
And then I also just want to point out that Richard will be signing books. We've got, I think, some books, people who have their books with him, An Ordinary Man, so it'll be set up right out here. And after you get that book signed, enjoy your evening. Thank you.